In front of a small house in a hollow stood an axe. The protagonist stepped onto the floor. His body was pumped up, and he said it was enviable. He raised an eyebrow in surprise, not understanding whose body he was in. Reifenhardt looked at his hands and noticed that they were all calloused, and his body was covered in scars and muscles. He remembered how in his youth the elves pressed themselves against him, admiring his body and coolness. The guy went to the mirror and asked where his chiseled face had gone. He touched his chin and assumed that he had not returned to the past, but had simply exchanged souls between two bodies. The protagonist frowned his red eyebrows and began to study his new features. He opened his mouth and thought about what would happen if he imagined this man a little whiter and with facial hair. The mage sweated when he realized that he looked exactly like Teslan. He turned around when he heard his name being called. The muscular man opened the door and said that the sun was already high in the sky. He leaned over and yelled loudly, asking why the boy was still sitting at home. He put his hands on his waist and said with a smile that today was another great day ahead of them. Reifenhardt turned pale with fear, looking at the huge stranger. He froze when the man approached him and asked why the boy was looking at him so strangely, as if he was seeing him for the first time. The mentor closed his eyes and asked if the student wanted to use the excuse of amnesia a second time. He grabbed the boy by the head. Then, smiling, he dragged him along with him to train. The protagonist sweated when he realized that this stranger was the mentor of Teslan, the strongest warrior of the continent of all time. Gerard smiled widely, closing his eyes. The boy was tied with ropes to a tree, begging the mentor to listen to him. The muscle man gagged him and said that he was talking too much today. Reifenhardt screamed when he saw Gerard reaching for the bamboo. His face was covered in sweat. The man hit him on his bare stomach. Tears gushed from the boy's eyes. A red mark was left on his body. He did not understand what was happening here. Gerard dealt the student random blows. The protagonist was crying, thinking about Cyrus. The man frowned and thought that his student's hands were softer than usual today. As he continued to attack, the trainer thought that short-term memory loss was common among members of their clan due to the grueling training. He smiled and thought that since the matter was trivial, the solution was simple. The boy cried while Gerard beat him. He swung his stick, shouting that those who are weak in body hide in armor behind swords. The man approached the protagonist and shouted that it was shameful not to be able to overcome one's weaknesses, and that training was needed for that. The mentor broke the bamboo and shouted that people, like steel, were tempered by blows. The veins stood out on his muscular arm, and he shouted that there were no limits to physical development. Then he closed his eyes and thought that not everyone could become stronger through training, because only high-quality iron became steel. Gerard hit the young man in the face. Beating him without stopping, the muscle man shouted for his student to think about the ocean. Reifenhardt closed his eyes and imagined himself with Cyrus on the seashore. He fell to the ground, and the trainer said that training was over for today. The magician hugged himself and thanked God for such a strong body. Stars were visible in the dark sky. Leaves floated in the water, and the protagonist assumed that this was a healing potion. He sat in the bath, thinking that one bottle cost 10 silver coins. Gerard put his hands behind his back and explained that steel always needed to be cooled after forging. Reifenhardt looked down and decided that the method was working. He remembered Teslan from the past and thought that he had been through similar training since he was a child. The boy lowered himself into the water and made sure that he had returned to the past after all. The moon was visible outside the window, and the magician mentally wondered where his body was now. He imagined his younger self and doubted that two identical souls could live in the same dimension. He frowned and came to two assumptions. The protagonist imagined two silhouettes and thought that there was he from the future, and he was in Teslan's body, and he coexisted with his current young self. Immersing half of his face in the water, the young man assumed that the king of martial arts was currently in the body of young Reifenhardt. He imagined the young magician with a bunch of books in his hands. The protagonist stood in front of a huge plate of meat, and Gerard shouted for him to start eating. While the young man was biting into the piece, the mentor was shouting that the overworked body needed to replenish its supply of nutrients. They were climbing the mountain. The mage had a huge load on his back. The muscle man was already sitting at the top, offering to continue the morning workout. Reifenhardt was pumping his abs, not understanding how long this merciless mess would continue. He lay motionless on the bed. Tears were streaming from his reddened eyes. The guy sat in the corner, thinking about how this would affect the future. He imagined the young mage in the library and thought that the uniqueness of the soul is an immutable rule of this world, but it can also happen that the soul will cease to exist. The protagonist bit his thumb and thought that young Reifenhart would be inactive as a mage for the next 10 years. But he, too, was constantly learning, reading books in the magic tower of Delphia. He imagined the skinny guy lifting dumbbells and thought that if Tessalon was in his body, then he would definitely come for him. He imagined himself pumped up and decided that the king of martial arts could find a way to become strong in this body. Reifenhart peeked out from around the corner and said that his priority now was to escape from this mental hospital. He quickly ran towards the forest. Gritting his teeth from the tension, he decided that he would definitely escape from here, no matter what happened. Suddenly, Gerard appeared in front of him, who asked with a smile where his student was going. The man touched his beard and said that this was the 9th time he tried to escape. The protagonist frowned and shouted that he was not Tessalon, but a mage named Reifenhart. The trainer looked at him with a grin, not believing his words. The guy opened his mouth in shock when the muscle man said that the last time he claimed that he came from another world, where there are gods and dragons. The mage sweated, and the man mentioned a great master from the Huan Empire in the east from a place called Murim. Gerard grabbed the student by the head and said with a smile that he had been especially convincing this time. Then he pulled him along, and the young man thought that he had failed today, but that he would definitely achieve his goal tomorrow. He bit his lip and decided that he would not allow himself to be locked here forever. The trainer looked out from behind a bush and said with a smile that the student reminded him of himself in his youth. Gerard looked into the water and said that he understood Reifenhart perfectly. He pulled him out of the water and said that he needed to be patient for a little while longer, and everything would pay off. The protagonist was on his knees. He had resigned himself to the fact that it was simply impossible to escape, and the trainer at that time was telling him that there had never been a single student who had not tried to escape. Beads of sweat were pouring down the young man's face, and he thought that if he was lucky enough to get out of here, this old man would still find him. The man crossed his arms and laughed, and the mage decided that it was better to officially get permission and leave these mountains. Gerard beat the student with a morning star. The chains lay on the floor, so Reifenhart spent 2 years. His body emitted a bright flame. He was able to awaken the aura. The mentor closed his eyes, shouting that there was nothing surprising in this. He took the weapon in his hands and said that if the instincts of self-preservation were developed in parallel with physical data, then the student's will to live would increase survival and also manifest his power, known as aura. He threw the weapon aside and said that they were moving on to the next stage. The man smiled widely, and his fist caught fire. He said that it was time for a sparring match with him. The protagonist froze in shock. A powerful explosion was visible in the distance. 3 more years passed. In the kingdom of Vasily, the Larchen Mountains were visible. A waterfall gurgled loudly. A young guy in good physical shape was standing on a stone. He clenched his hand into a fist. The abundance of his muscles was noticeable. The protagonist's fist glowed brightly. He bent down, preparing to attack. Then he slammed his hand against the stone wall. The boy frowned, deciding that he was not doing enough. Since the 3rd stage was his limit at the moment, he stood in front of the destroyed wall and said that he needed to somehow advance to the 4th stage. He raised his hand and thought that the final stage of the Horn of Calamity technique was a strike that called out 9 waves, and this strike could kill even a god. But even Master Gerard had only reached the 8th stage. Reifenhart placed his hands on his waist and thought that his mentor had promised to let him leave the mountains only if he reached at least the 4th stage. He looked at his hand and said that in the past, he would have definitely escaped, but now he needed to complete his endurance training. He raised his hands, concentrating magical energy. Then he fired an air bullet at a nearby tree. There was a light black mark left. The protagonist scratched his head and realized that his body was clearly resisting the magic. Suddenly, he looked to the side. He looked at the path from which he felt the inhuman energy. A green foot was visible. The orc came out from behind the tree, holding a sword in his hand. Reifenhart frowned. Then the orc said, "If you want to live, pretend you don't see me." And that's the end of this chapter. If you enjoyed the recap, don't forget to like, comment which part hyped you the most, and subscribe for the next episode. See you in the next upload.